Welcome to Educator Self-Regulate, a podcast for educational leaders, teachers, and students, where in less than 20 minutes, we unpack educational research to support you and your students to become better learners.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Educator Self-Regulate. I'm joined here by the lovely Michael Rosenbrock. Hi, Mike. How are you?
Hey, Shai, really well.
We've been spending a lot of time together last week in Melbourne while we were both there for different workshops, and we've been having long chats about all sorts of things education. But we have a shared interest in the space of metacognition, which I love. But Mike, remind me, I was trying to think about when we connected, and I think it was when you were working for Evidence for Learning.
It would have been, yeah, it would have been back when I was working for Evidence for Learning, which is a couple of years ago now. So, yeah.
Yeah. But I actually came across your name through one of whether it was a case study or a implementation kind of
Yeah,
story of your
yeah,
work at.
exactly that. Yeah, we did an implementation case study on some work we did at my school in Wodonga on implementing Metacog. So, yeah,
Yeah, that's when your name came up on my
yeah,
radar. I need to know this guy because
yeah.
we were in the space.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I guess just for our listeners, you obviously have a background in education. You were teaching leadership, like the whole shebang, rather.
Yeah, the full trajectory, I guess, or the full experience, I suppose. I've done many different things from being a classroom teacher of maths, science, and a few other things like multimedia, because sometimes you kind of teach what you can, and also a science curriculum area leader, a maths and science leader, leading teacher, and an assistant principal. So many different roles in school, and then spent a bit of time in the last couple of years outside of school doing, as you sort of alluded to, some work for Evidence for Learning, which has been wonderful. And then the last couple of years working for myself around, mostly in the space of supporting schools and systems and educators to be evidence informed. And for me, that means using professional expertise to draw together evidence from research, evidence from practice, and evidence from the particular context into doing something that really matters in that context.
I love that, and this is why we're so aligned. But we're also Amber Press family. And
Exactly, yeah. Why
is
do I
your
not have a book within reach? They always do
no,
this.
no,
I'm just out of reach.
where's
I should
Michael?
have done closer. I'm gonna disappear off the screen. No,
Yeah, I've got it. I've got
there
it.
you go. See, that's good. You got it in reach. Yeah. So the printing principle with, of course, Dr. Simon Breakspear. It's been a delight to do that work with Simon, and I have a real passion for that implementation side of things as well. So finding the ways to make things work effectively because a lot of things may be a good idea, but the implementation doesn't quite isn't necessarily always up to scratch, and we do need to make some space for the things that matter. So pruning is very much about that. Also an avid gardener, so I love the pruning metaphor and happy to go a little bit down the rabbit hole of what type of pruning when and what the seasons mean and different pruning for different purposes. So yeah, it's been a great.
I have to admit, I like that title, but B, I just think pruning when it comes to teaching self-regulated learning and metacognition, I
Mm,
think that sort of mindset, not just for leaders, but for teachers, uh,
yeah.
is really important. I think I've only read half the book, but I love the message that you're sending and
And
recommend to our listeners to get themselves a copy.
awesome. And I do love that sort of the gardening type metaphors as well in education because we are nurturing things, we're caring for things, we're trying to help them to grow. So it kind of brings that care and concern and discerning choices to our thinking.
Now, Mike, we're talking metacognition, particularly in the science classroom here for our listeners, but yeah, I think a lot of the stuff we'll be talking about still translates into other classroom contexts. So if you're not a science teacher or you're not a specialist in that kind of context, absolutely fine. Please listen along because I think this will still be valuable to you. Um, but I thought before we even get into why we think metacognition is important, Mike, I thought we should clarify whether we're on the same page with the definition of metacognition. So I'll ask you the question, like, how do you conceptualize or define metacognition from your lens?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one thing I think doing a lot of work with teachers, and we can sort of end up spending a bit of time going in circles around with the definition or not feeling like it's meaningful enough. So what I typically and where I typically land is that we know metacognition by doing it. That's my position really, that we can talk about it being learning to learn or having those strategies to go through a process of planning, monitoring, evaluating. But I think that still somehow seems like not enough. So for me, I really love the idea of just getting to know what metacognition is like by putting it in practice.
Amazing. Okay. So why is this concept of metacognition so important for the science classroom?
I think, as you've alluded, obviously it's important for all classrooms, but I do see a beautiful alignment in a sense with science because when we think about the nature of science and the nature of working scientifically, so core to that is this way of being, of taking in new information as it arises and revising our understanding and changing. I mean, that's fundamental to science, that it changes over time. And it's something that we fundamentally want our science students to take away is maybe not whilst the content knowledge is obviously also important for many career pathways and for being able to engage with things scientifically in the world, there's also that relationship with science and what it means to be scientific. And I think that's just so deeply intertwined with Metacog. Even if we think about Metacog as being a one way of approaching it being a process of planning, monitoring, and evaluating, that kind of a process aligns really closely with what we might see as a scientific method, where we plan something, we put it into place, and we monitor it carefully, and then we evaluate it after we're doing it. So that kind of plan, monitor, evaluate thinking is so important to so many parts of science.
So you've kind of touched on then what it might look like in a science classroom in terms of a learner working themselves through as they're engaging in that scientific inquiry or conducting a lab experiment or some sort of practical inquiry. They're actually navigating that planning, monitoring, and evaluating process. Is there other ways that we might see it in a science classroom or in other classrooms?
Yeah, I think there's many different ways we might see it come up. And I think another part of it is just that discussion element that we might see in a science classroom being important when we're kind of grappling with, we have these sort of, in a sense, sometimes threshold concepts that there's a lot of a need to engage with kind of quite deeply and to try and look at how we kind of I guess often in science, we're working with very limited models of our understanding, and we then kind of are trying to, in a sense, ratchet up those models over time. So we might introduce some notion around forces in year 5, 6, or 7, which is a very simplified version of what we then do in year 10, which is a simplified version of what we do after that, and a simplified version of what comes after that. So even as we structured discussion and our own teacher explanations in class, I think it's really important to bring that thinking to the fore because often we're thinking about what's the appropriate model, what's the best way to understand this at this level, what's the best tool, what's the best thinking frame I can use, which may not be the most correct or the most complex one, but it's the one that's right for that piece of point in time.
Now, Mike, I just had a moment where we have another connection. You're a science teacher, isn't it, Mike?
Yeah.
As am I. And I have to admit, when I was full-time teaching science, this was pre-PhD, so perhaps my kind of philosophy of knowledge was pretty surface level. But I was probably holding science knowledge in a little bit of a fixed fashion. Like it was quite absolute in my brain in the way that I was teaching it. And so I was using models to sort of say, right, this is our concept of forces.
Yeah.
And in essence, you all should adopt this kind of concept.
Mm.
Whereas now I probably hold scientific knowledge a little bit more lightly and recognize that actually our knowledge is constantly changing. We do see misconceptions around science in the field now, in the way that we're understanding the way the world works. How can we help students use metacognitive strategies to engage in a deeper level of critical thinking?
Yeah, thanks, Shai. And I think like misconceptions in particularly, like they can be somewhat predictable sometimes. Like we can anticipate that certain misconceptions will absolutely arise at certain points in our learning journey in school science. And that's often because those misconceptions, or some people call them preconceptions, because they're sometimes reasonably formed, right? So thinking about physics teachers, so it's always going to be physics with my examples pretty much. But a lot of our misconceptions around forces are just from the fact that we don't necessarily understand that friction is in place, that friction's a force and it's present in all these things that we do and see. And once you have that model of friction, that can then adjust our understanding of what, why and how things move and to see that, oh, a thing doesn't need a force to move. It only needs a force to overcome the friction that's opposing its motion. So a lot of it is about sort of creating these opportunities to engage with some dialogue or some thinking or some challenging of those preconceptions so that they can be shifted. And we know that takes a bit of time and a bit of experience. One thing that I have really loved doing, and it's about getting this at the right time and having the right supports in place. So in order to do this, I've needed to have had my class for a little bit of time, got them to be able to discuss well together, to be able to discuss respectfully, and to accept disagreement and different perspectives. So all those sort of foundations need to be in place. But what I really love to do on a number of select occasions through as we get into our senior secondary, year 11, year 12 physics, is to just pick some of those key misconceptions and spend a whole lesson on sort of deep dive engaging with one of them. And normally using a scenario, just a particular scenario that's going to bring up that misconception, and then supporting students to have a bit of a Socratic discussion about that. So it could be like a diagram or something where students are looking at a particular scenario and talking about what forces are involved. So the idea here is to build up that ability to have a discussion and to ask good questions, to be able to address misconceptions, but also to be able to hopefully internalize that questioning, right? I found this to be really effective. And the protocol to scaffold it is to have the students do an answer for themselves and then to have a scaffolded discussion in a group of, say, 2 or 3. And then they produce an artifact that can be put on the wall. And for me to facilitate a whole class discussion where students have to explain their perspective on the answer and try and convince others to move to their side or to go the other way. So I think being able to get to the point of facilitating that discussion can be a really great way to build up some of those metacognitive questioning skills, but also the reflection and that willingness to change perspective.
Mike, can I ask, are you explicitly teaching students in that scenario the types of questions that you would want them to be internalizing and asking themselves as they go through that scaffolding?
Yeah, I mean, depending on where we're at with that sort of building, that sometimes I'll just put on the board or on somewhere visible some sentence stems for kind of ways to ask a challenging question, those kind of prompts, because through no fault of their own, students can come out with quite strong language sometimes. One of the prompts I've used, depends on the cohort though and where we're at, but is sort of like you must first reflect your understanding of what the other person has said and then reflect your challenge to that understanding or agreement. So you first reflect their understanding and then provide challenge or agreement. So, modeling that. And sometimes I think with these discussions, it's definitely an active facilitation too. So sometimes I will just step in and do some questioning and then step back to just keep modeling that, particularly also if the discussion gets a bit stuck, because that can be useful. And students need practice of these kind of experiences because we all get good at reading the room, right? So the students will look at where's the person they think is the most knowledgeable, where have they gone? And do they need to follow that social cue and follow them? And it's trying to also get that reasoned decision making happening.
Yeah, amazing. And even just the way you scaffolded, like the way they have to provide feedback in those conversations, I think that's really powerful in terms of building their own kind of their metacognitive skills, but also their kind of the way they're framing up arguments in their mind, acknowledging the value in someone's understanding first. Yeah.
Like it slows down the jumping in with the correction or the alternate view. It sort of slows down that because they have to process and summarize what the other person said first.
Yeah, it makes me think of I think it's Project Zero's ladder of feedback.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
So much great stuff there.
Yeah, just even getting them to think about, I've used adapted versions of that, but what's valuable in this information, what's valuable in what you've just heard, before you dive in with the comments and suggestions. I think they start with clarifying questions, like you clarify the understanding first, then you indicate your sort of values and things like that, what you value in what you've heard, and then of course you can start to maybe challenge, comment, suggest, and so on and so forth. There's different versions of it, isn't it?
It's interesting you say that too, Chai, because I think, and I'd love to know your perspective on this, but sometimes I feel like what we're doing in Metacog is trying to, in some ways, in some parts of it at least, trying to help students to internalize effective feedback practices.
I agree completely. I think on some level, I sort of see metacognition as a bit of an internal conversation. And so it's almost allowing that internal conversation or improving the quality of that internal conversation to then allow us to communicate in a really meaningful and effective ways in it, not just to ourselves, but to those outside of us.
Yes, having helpful voices in your head.
Yes, yeah.
Yes, getting more of the helpful voice in your head. Absolutely agree.
I like that notion of thinking about feedback in the role of metacognition in feedback. I think that's important. I'm conscious of time, Mike. One more question for you, because I know a lot of our listeners have shared with me the tension between sort of covering curriculum content and then prioritizing skills like metacognition and self-regulated learning. Any advice?
Yeah, I mean, two things. I think it's one of these areas where we might be investing what seems like a bit of time, a bit of instructional time, a bit of class time in trying to build that student independence and student agency. But it should pay off in the longer term, as in students being able to be more independent, be more metacognitive, being able to help themselves more before they need our support. It should probably save some time in the longer run. Unfortunately, sometimes maybe you're saving time for a future teacher rather than yourselves, but there's sort of a bigger picture thing there. And also, just to come back to the feedback point, like a lot of the metacognitive stuff I've focused my efforts on in terms of my own teaching has been probably in the scaffolded reflection side of things, and things like guided self-marking and having feedback and reflection protocols and reflection logbooks and things like that. Like I found that to be it's maybe used a bit more class time, but has actually saved an enormous amount of outside of class time in terms of the way that marking is done. So I've commonly used a protocol to basically on certain assessments to guide students to self-mark in pairs, where and then going through a bit of a feedback and reflection protocol where then as a whole class we go through the whole assessment, but with the pair self-marking kind of approach there, students get really good at self-feedback on what's right and what's wrong, but it also just reduces the amount of time that I'm spending doing that. I found that to be a really good time saver.
You typically get me in that, sorry, I need to clarify there. So if they've got clear criteria, they obviously have a deep understanding of what that criteria means that allows them to self-mark or peer mark.
Yeah, so I would do it normally, most commonly, and talking in physics again, probably where we're mostly looking at things which are quite clearly yes, right or wrong kind of things, but there might be a marking scheme. So, in senior physics, I would give students the full marking scheme, and we would then work through the different components of the assessment, as in, we're all doing question one. Use the marking scheme to mark up your work. If you've got a question, ask me. If you want to challenge what someone else has said, ask me, and then I'll briefly summarize. And when everyone's content, we move on, and then we go through the whole marking scheme and then some guided reflection prompts and reflection logbooks to kind of connect that to past effort and future work. But, getting students to do that effectively and efficiently over time can just save a huge amount of time. There's some potential in that. And I love it. There's some potential in that one, so I'm keen on.
No, I love that. And it obviously fits really nicely. If we use the three phases like planning, monitoring, evaluating, if that's your sort of position, then it fits really nicely with the self-evaluation component of self-regulated learning, isn't it? I would love to see conversations in classrooms where students actually understand what effective self-regulated learning looks like and can almost start to self-evaluate where they're at in terms of that skill set. Because we often talk about self-marking or self-evaluating in terms of the subject context. But, just as, I don't know, that came to mind and I was like, oh, I wonder what that would look like if it was getting students to reflect on, say, a thinking process or a process of learning. What does an effective learning look like in this?
Drawing out the bigger picture, yes, that's a really interesting aspect, I think. And like you've done, over time and with some sequence thought and maybe with some similarity between practices that students might experience in different subjects too, you could really start to draw that together.
Yeah. This might sound a bit fluffy, but like rising above the content to think about that overarching so that we
because you want to be, that's right, you want to be like it, right? You want to be going, well, this was the content, but this is what I learned about regulating my learning above that, exactly that. So that study strategy wasn't effective, or when I got stuck and I just gave up, like, okay, what can I do to help myself with that? Like I just stopped. All those sorts of things.
Of course. Now, mate, with time in mind, you are familiar with our famous On the Reg segment. I would love to ask you, Mike, what's a strategy that you use to self-regulate or metacognitively regulate your own learning?
Yeah, look, a really important strategy for me is just a proactive one and just getting myself in a good space to be able to regulate myself and my learning. And that's, I tried meditation for many years, but it's not really been my thing. So for me, what really helps me is to get out of the mind and into the body and to regularly do things like walking or cycling or running. And I find that a really good reset, but it also just seems to provide, that sort of, I don't know, it just provides some space. And sometimes it brings about really good reflections. and really good insights that I just don't get anywhere else. So I find that it's a bit tangential there perhaps, but that is something that I really love to do.
No, yeah, it's a tool, it's a strategy that you use to help regulate, which I love. I'll share one as well, and perhaps this has a bit of synergy to your book, Mike. Last year, I set one word each year as a bit of a goal, strategic goal for myself. And so last year, my word was essential. And it is now embedded into sort of my internal language where I'll ask myself, particularly now because I'm managing quite a high workload, I'm asking myself quite regularly, is this essential? Is this essential for my core goals, my focus here? And so that's just such a simple self-question that I'm using in essence to prune back the array of jobs or tasks or emails that come at me to almost filter and triage, like, what is my level of priority for this? And is this absolutely essential right now? So it's so simple, but I'm finding it super powerful just asking that question for everything.
I love that. And I mean, we've talked at length about our work and the nature of how it's easy to take on a lot of work, but also as the work of a teacher. I mean, I think I had a discussion with a colleague early in my career who said, teaching is infinite work. You have to choose where to draw the line because you can always do more. So you've got to choose what matters and where to draw the line.
Man, I love that. What a note to end on. Now, if listeners want to learn more about your work or potentially find out about how you can help them, Mike, where do they go for that?
Yeah, well, they can stalk me on LinkedIn or just generally on the internet. I mean, a reasonably unique name. So michaelrosenbrock.com is where you will certainly find me, but just Google me. And also we're doing some really nice work with the Science Teachers Association of Victoria, running a little Metacog specifically in scientific inquiry, professional learning project. So yeah, that's happening a bit around the state in Victoria. If you're local, I'd love to see you there.
Amazing. We'll include some of those links, etc., underneath the podcast notes. Mate, it has been an absolute pleasure.
If you are a new listener to the podcast, make sure you share it with friends, save it, or subscribe. And if you have any questions, and we really want to hear from our listeners, if you have any questions or comments, send us a DM through either of our social media channels, which is Twitter and Instagram at ed2selfreg. As always, to you and everyone else out there, keep regulating.